Hi, welcome to ArkIntel. The United Kingdom, once an empire that spanned the globe, wielding unmatched influence and power, a nation that symbolized strength, prosperity, and resilience, now finds itself at a crossroads, grappling with an unprecedented economic and social turmoil. The question is, what went wrong? How did a country that once ruled over half the world finds itself teetering on the brink of financial disaster? The UK, a beacon of stability for centuries, now faces a crisis that could reshape its future for decades to come. Today, let's dive deep into the economic unraveling of the UK, exposing the critical mistakes and uncovering the harsh lessons that can no longer be ignored. Because what's happening in Britain today isn't just a British problem, it's a global warning. This is more than just an economic crisis. It's a wake-up call for the world. The crisis unveiled. As of 2024, the UK's national debt has surged to a staggering 99.5% of its GDP, equating to over £2.5 trillion. This is nearly double that of Germany's debt to GDP ratio of 63.7% and significantly higher than India's at 58.2% and Ireland's at 42.5%. But this isn't just about numbers. It's a red flag signaling deep-rooted structural problems that have been festering for years. This level of debt, the highest since World War II, is not just a burden. It's a looming threat to the UK's economic stability. Compounding this is a labour crisis that's gripping the nation. The workforce is shrinking, with over 2.5 million people unable to work due to long-term sickness, a trend that has worsened since the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the 2008 financial crash, UK productivity has remained stagnant, growing at an average annual rate of just 0.3%. Hospitals are overwhelmed, with nearly 45% of emergency patients waiting over 4 hours for care compared to just 5% a decade ago. Meanwhile, the logistics sector faces a shortage of 100,000 truck drivers, leading to supply chain disruptions that have left supermarket shelves empty and consumers frustrated. In a country where inflation has soared over 11%, the highest in 40 years, millions are being pushed into poverty. Food bank usage has skyrocketed, with over 2 million people forced to skip meals each month just to make ends meet. And here's the startling reality. If you take London out of the equation, the rest of the UK has the economic standing of Mississippi, America's poorest state. This paints a stark picture of inequality and economic disparity within the nation. How did it come to this? To understand it, let's dive into the root causes of this crisis. If you were to take a step back and review, the turning point for the UK's economic trajectory can be traced back to June 23, 2016, the unfortunate event, Brexit. On this day, 52% of the population voted to leave the European Union, enticed by promises of taking back control, reducing immigration, and regaining economic sovereignty. But the reality that unfolded was far more complex and far less optimistic. To fully grasp the impact of this decision, we must revisit the history of European Union and its deep significance to the UK. The rise of the European Union. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe was in ruins, its nations shattered by a conflict and its economies devastated. But from this devastation emerged a bold vision: unity as the path of recovery. In 1951, 6 nations, Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the West Germany, formed the European Coal and Steel Community, laying the groundwork for what would become the European Union in 1993 under the Maastricht Treaty. For the UK, joining the EU in 1973 meant access to a single market of over 450 million people, boosting industries like finance, manufacturing, and services. The advantages were immense, particularly for the City of London, which became the financial capital of Europe, attracting investment from around the globe. By 2015, the EU accounted for 44% of the UK's exports and 53% of its imports, highlighting the deep economic ties between the UK and its European neighbours. But as the benefits accumulated, so did the costs. The UK's contributions to the EU budget averaged around 10 billion euros per year, money that many felt could be better spent on domestic needs. Additionally, the EU's policies on immigration became increasingly controversial. Between 2004 and 2016, the foreign-born population in the UK doubled, largely due to the free movement of people within EU. This surge was seen by some as a strain on public services and a threat to British jobs, feeling discontent that would eventually lead to Brexit. The decision to leave. As the years passed, discontent grew within the UK. Many felt that the nation was shouldering an unfair burden, contributing billions to the EU while seeing less in return. By 2015, the UK was the second largest net contributor to the EU budget after Germany, contributing £12.9 billion while receiving far less in return. European fishermen were reaping the bounty of British waters under the Common Fisheries Policy, while UK fishermen faced restrictive quotas that stifled their livelihoods. Brexit promised to address these issues by restoring sovereignty and control. The Leave campaign painted a picture of an independent UK, free to negotiate its own trade deals and control its borders. But amidst the fervour, one critical question was overlooked. What would happen after the divorce? The promises of freedom and prosperity seemed alluring, but the aftermath would prove far more daunting. In the run-up to the Brexit vote, the debate was fierce and polarized. On one side were those who believed that leaving the EU would restore the UK's sovereignty and allow it to forge its own path in the world. On the other side were those who warned that leaving the EU would have severe economic consequences, particularly for trade and investment. The decision to leave was ultimately driven by a desire to regain control. But the reality of what that control meant would soon become painfully clear. Brexit, the aftermath. Leaving the EU meant severing ties with the customs union, abruptly halting the frictionless trade the UK had enjoyed with its largest trading partner. Goods that once moved freely across the channel now faced tariffs, custom checks, and regulatory hurdles, driving up costs for businesses and consumers alike. In 2021 alone, UK exports to the EU fell by 14% and imports dropped by 25%, representing billions in lost trade. The UK quickly sought free trade agreements with countries like Japan, Australia, and New Zealand to regain lost ground. However, these deals couldn't fully compensate for the loss of the access to the EU's single market. The automotive industry, heavily reliant on the seamless flow of parts across the EU, was hit particularly hard. Production costs soared, and some manufacturers like Nissan and Honda began considering relocating within the EU to avoid added complexities and expenses. Even small businesses faced new challenges, struggling with increased paperwork, delays, and added costs. The financial services sector, a cornerstone of the UK economy, also took a major hit. Major financial institutions, including HSBC and JP Morgan, shifted billions in assets and thousands of jobs from London to cities like Frankfurt, Paris, and Dublin, eroding the UK's status as Europe's financial hub. The service economy trap. And here's where a deeper underlying weakness in the UK's economy was exposed. The country's heavy reliance on services, over 81% of GDP, comes from sectors like finance, IT, and professional services, had long been a double-edged sword. Services can be incredibly lucrative, but they can also be incredibly fragile. Unlike manufacturing, which can be scaled and provides jobs across a broad spectrum of skills, services are vulnerable to economic shocks. For decades, the UK had neglected its manufacturing base. From 1997 to 2021, the UK's manufacturing output fell from 22% of GDP to just 9%, leading to factory closures, job losses, and the decline of entire communities. When crises hit, like the financial crash of 2008 or the COVID-19 pandemic, there were no production lines to keep the economy moving. The UK had become a nation with a hollowed-cut industrial core, overly dependent on services that could not weather the storm. This over-reliance on financial services has made the UK particularly vulnerable to fluctuations in global markets. When the world economy sneezes, the UK catches a cold, and with Brexit, the situation became even more precarious, as some financial institutions began moving their operations to the EU cities to avoid the uncertainty around the UK's future relationship with Europe. The uneven distribution of economic growth further exacerbated these challenges. While London and the Southeast thrived, other regions lagged behind. Manufacturing towns, once the backbone of the UK's economy, were left to decay with little investment or support. This economic imbalance created deep divisions within the country, fueling the discontent that led to Brexit and deepening the crisis in its aftermath. A nation in labor crisis. Compounding these economic woes is a labor crisis of epic proportions. Since Brexit, an estimated 200,000 EU citizens have left the UK, leaving gaping holes in critical sectors. The National Health Service, NHS, is short by 30,000 nurses struggling to provide the care that the public desperately needs. Industries from hospitality to transport are desperately trying to fill over 890,000 vacancies, but the workforce is simply not there. This shortage isn't just an inconvenience, it's a ticking time bomb. As businesses strain to operate without enough staff, productivity falls and the economy grinds to a slower pace. The ripple effects are felt throughout society, deepening the crisis and making recovery all the more difficult. The agriculture sector, for instance, has been hit particularly hard. Many farms relied on seasonal workers from the EU to harvest crops, but with Brexit, that labour force has dwindled. In 2021, an estimated £60 million worth of crops were left to rot in the fields due to labour shortages. Similarly, the construction industry, which depended heavily on skilled labour from Europe, now faces delays and rising costs as it struggles to fill the gap. The labour shortages are also feeding into the broader inflation crisis. With fewer workers available, wages are rising. Average earning increased by 6.4% in 2023 alone. But so are prices. Businesses are passing these higher costs on to consumers, further squeezing household budgets at a time when many are already struggling to make ends meet. The global shockwaves. And then came the external shocks, the COVID-19 pandemic, which hit the UK harder than any other time in the past 300 years, and the Russia-Ukraine war, which sent global supply chains into disarray and energy prices soaring. The pound sterling, once a symbol of British economic might, has lost over 20% of its value against the dollar since 2016, and inflation is running rampant. The government finds itself trapped in a vicious cycle of low growth and rising poverty, with no easy way out. The pandemic exposed the fragility of global supply chains and the dangers of over-reliance on just-in-time manufacturing. As borders closed and factories shut down, the flow of goods was disrupted, leading to shortages and price spikes. The UK, with its heavy reliance on imports, like for example, over 60% of the UK's food supply is imported, was particularly vulnerable to these disruptions. Energy prices, already rising due to the global shift towards renewable energy, were pushed even higher by the Russia-Ukraine war. The UK, which had become increasingly dependent on imported energy, found itself at the mercy of the global markets. As gas prices soared, so did household energy bills, up by 54% in 2022 alone, adding to the financial pressure on already struggling families. Lessons for the world. So, what can other nations learn from the UK's decline? The lessons are profound and universally applicable. Firstly, a balanced economy is essential. Relying too heavily on services or any single sector leaves a nation vulnerable to global shocks. Diversification is key, not just in the economy, but also in trade relationships and sources of income. Countries need to build resilient manufacturing bases that provide jobs, ensure economic stability, and can withstand crisis. Secondly, major decisions like Brexit highlight the importance of thorough analysis and expert guidance. Populist rhetoric and short-term political gains should not drive economic policy. The consequences of such decisions can reverberate for decades, affecting not just the domestic economy but also international relations and global markets. Thirdly, the interconnectedness of today's world means that no nation can afford to isolate itself. Globalization has tied economies together in ways that make collaboration and cooperation not just beneficial but necessary. Countries must navigate the interconnected world with care, striking the right balance between national interests and global responsibilities. Lastly, economic inequality with a nation can lead to deep divisions and social unrest. It's vital to ensure that the benefits of economic growth are shared across all regions and demographics, avoiding the pitfalls of concentrated wealth and power in specific areas. In the end, the story of the UK is a cautionary tale, a powerful reminder that the decisions we make today can reverberate through the decades. For the UK, the road to recovery will be long and difficult, but the lessons learned could help prevent others from making the same mistakes. As we navigate an uncertain global economy, it's more important than ever to find the right balance between growth, stability, and collaboration. The choices made now will determine not just the future of one nation, but the future of all of us. After all, we are a global economy. What impacts somebody will eventually impact everybody.